Stories are such powerful things. We tell them in our own heads. We tell them while we're asleep. We tell them to each other. We tell them about our past and our future, our ancestors and our communities. The author, Jonathan Gottschall, wrote the book, The Storytelling Animal. And he says that the quality that distinguishes us most evolutionarily from our other animal kin is not our tool-making or linguistic ability, but rather our ability to create stories. He asserts through examining research on the subject that these stories allowed our evolutionary ancestors to do a better job of bonding together. Why would it make sense? Why would it be an evolutionary advantage for people to sit around a fire and tell lies to each other rather than spend that time foraging or hunting? It doesn't make sense. But the reason is that these stories bind us in a group. They give us an identity together so that we are more effective in our community, in our battles for survival. But the problem with stories is that they are rarely complete or totally accurate. The storyteller tells the story from their own perspective. Other perspectives are immediately lost. And once the story gets created, it carries on a life of its own. And if that story gathers meaning and value in the community, then people become less and less likely to change it or challenge it, because challenging the story means challenging the group or challenging our very identity. When I was about 18 or 19, I was in college in Dallas at Southern Methodist University, and I took my first religion class on the Christian Bible, also known as the New Testament, and my amazing professor, Dr. Chansey, who I'm still friends with on Facebook, shout out to Dr. Chansey, was helping us deconstruct the various books of this part of the Bible from a historic perspective, understand what was happening at the time, why these books said the way things they said, and why. And many of my classmates, themselves 18 or 19 years old, many of them had been raised in fundamentalist Christian households. They had been taught that the Bible is the literal word of God, inerrant, completely internally compatible with itself. And when they were in this class, realizing these inconsistencies, they had one of two reactions. Complete rejection of what Professor Chansey was teaching, because to incorporate this new information was too threatening to the story that they held, or the other option was complete loss of faith, that any challenge to that story was too threatening and they had to throw the entire thing out, one or the other. And it was powerful and heartbreaking for me to witness, because I did not have that kind of religious upbringing, so I was just enjoying this class. But to watch how people's identities were so intricately linked with these stories that a threat to the story was a threat to their faith. And so I wrote that story, the Wonderbox story, several years ago, and I had those friends in mind when I was writing the story, because I had compassion for the pain that they were feeling at losing what they thought was an unbreakable story. And some of us might have had similar experiences in our own lives, maybe a faith or religious experience that you had to change or integrate or lose a story. But religious stories are not the only ones we hold tightly to. Historical, cultural, personal stories we also hold tightly, and they can also be fragile. And like most stories, they're not complete. The stories that we tell about our nation and who discovered it, the equality of everyone's voice, the events that were formative in the creation of our communities. I think about some of the stories we even tell here at the fellowship about how we came to be, and some of them there's truth to them, but there's also some sort of mythology that we hold to. These two are like, yeah, a little bit. We tell stories about the role of war in our nation's place in the world. So many stories, and we tell them over and over, and we allow them to form our identities. So here's a story from my own family. When I was 5, or so the story goes, my mom brought me to my first day of kindergarten. Like all good parents, she came into the room to help me get settled, wanted to talk to the teacher for a few minutes, and I was mortified. "Mom, go home," I said, and my mom insisted on staying and talking to the teacher for a few minutes. Even though every other parent was also there with their child, I was embarrassed that my mom thought I was a baby. And then later that same day, when our half day was over, my mom came to pick me up, just like all the other parents. And kindergarten at that school was full day, but it was half day, I think, for the first few days, just to get us used to school. And the bus didn't run at the lunch hour, but I insisted on riding the bus home. And the way this story has gone down in our family is that I got on the bus alone except for the driver. My mom had to follow the bus in her car because the bus driver didn't know where to drop me off because my mom was behind him, and so he flew past our house. And I was so little I could barely see out the window. And again, I was 5, so I probably didn't know where to go. My mom had to chase down this bus driver to safely get me off the bus. And the moral of this story that has made its way through the legends of Leone family folklore is Christina was an independent kid, determined to be on her own from the get-go. And this story has been told so many times, I remember that bus. Now, I'm certain that I actually cannot remember that bus. I don't even remember what our house looked like when I was 5. But this story has been told so many times that it's like I can remember it. It has been embedded into the core of who I am. I have lived into this story as I have grown. Now, maybe this is just who I am, but I think that this story, and many others like it, helped shape who I am. I'm Christina, the short, little control freak and independent type. Now, I'm grateful for that story. That's a sweet story. My parents, it's a joke, it's funny. They always tell it about how they freaked out about it, but they tell it over and over again because they think it's sweet, that I was so strong and independent even though I was really little. It was a positive quality, and that's why they tell that story over and over again. But there are other stories that can embed themselves into us, stories that are not as positive, stories of shame or neglect or trauma, and they can also become embedded. And it can take a lot of work to unlearn those stories, to rewrite those stories. But it's important to know that they can be rewritten. We can extricate those stories and add nuance to them, which is the key here. Stories can be more flexible than we give them credit for. Stories don't have to shatter at the first sign of pressure. We can incorporate hard things into our stories without destroying them. Complexity does not ruin a story. Complexity does not ruin a story. Unitarian Universalism is a faith that honors and can hold complexity if we let it. It can allow us to hold more than one truth at the same time. We can simultaneously honor the bravery of people who voluntarily serve in our military while also rejecting the military-industrial complex and the role of war as our nation's go-to mechanism for diplomacy. We can do both. We can recognize the power of immigration that was and continues to be a shaping force in our nation, while also recognizing the impact of colonization. We can recognize the powerful good that can come from religion, while also acknowledging the powerful harm that it has caused in our world. Complexity doesn't have to ruin the story. It can make it stronger. Turning now to the personal. My own 2 children came into our family through adoption, and we talk openly about adoption in our family because we believe that it is something good that doesn't need to be hidden or be ashamed of. We try to be honest with our children. We don't ever want them to remember a time that they didn't know that they were adopted and what that meant. But adoption tends to be talked about in one of 2 ways, either all good or all bad. And it's too complex for that, logistically, morally, and most importantly, emotionally. For me, adopting my children was the most beautiful, joyful experience that I could possibly have ever been given. But there were birth families and foster families who experienced profound and devastating loss because of our gain. The story that adoptive children often hear is either too pretty, God chose you for us, you're so lucky to have such wonderful parents. Adoption is about love. Or the story is sometimes just too ugly. I was given up at birth. My real mom didn't want me. Adoption is just taking kids away from their families and their cultures. Of course, there is truth in both of those, in the love and the luck and the pain and the distance. There is truth to all of these things, but none of these stories on their own is enough. None of them have enough complexity to be true or helpful. So the story we try to tell in our family is that our children were deeply wanted and deeply loved. They were wanted and loved by their first families. They were wanted and loved by their foster families. They were wanted and loved by us. That the choice that their first families made for them was out of love. We grieve with our children that their birth families were not able to give them the life that they wanted to. But we also celebrate with them that our family is whole because of them. Of course, the story will continue to evolve as they grow and change and deepen, and they begin to have more opinions and thoughts about it all themselves. But telling the truth about their adoptions, about adoption in general, even the hard parts of the truth, does not negate the story. Complexity only makes the story stronger. As I think about complexity and simplicity, I think about how our brains are wired to sort of do the most simple thing, right? To go to the simplest answer. Everything is black or white, good or bad, until we take a moment to investigate. So we have to pause. And one of the things I do sometimes in pastoral care when people are visiting with me is something called reality testing. They come into me and they're in a sad, difficult place in their life and they have hard things happen and now they're telling themselves a story. I'm all alone. I'm a bad mother. I'm never going to succeed. And I can say, okay, I hear that that's the story right now. But let's check that against reality. Let's test and see if anything gets a little more complex. And so I can remind them that their child follows them around like a little duckling and wants to be with them. Or I can remind them, look at their phone and see who called them yesterday or last week, and remind them of the times that they have survived or thrived through hard things in the past. And these facts can muddy the waters of the simple story that they have, which can be hard in and of itself. Like Annika said, even a negative story can feel comfortable because it's the one we know. To test against that can be a little painful. But our emotions are very good at telling intense but simple stories. That's what our emotions are the best at. Intense simplicity. Adding some nuance can reduce the intensity and give us a little bit more room to have possibility. As I think back at my time volunteering for years in a prison in Maryland, I think about my good friend Dave. Dave was convicted of a very serious crime. He was convicted as an adult even though he was 16. Life without parole. While on the inside, Dave came to terms with his childhood, his trauma history. He became a Buddhist. He started mentoring younger guys, teaching. He earned college credits, and soon he became the lead facilitator of the emotional literacy class that I taught in this prison. When the laws in Maryland changed just a few years ago to allow retrial of those who had been sentenced as adults when they were younger than 18, Dave had a chance at parole. Long, dramatic story short, Dave has been free for a couple years now, adjusting as a 50-something-year-old man to life in the outside world that he hasn't encountered since he was 16 years old. Dave and I were texting the other day. We talk online a few times a year now. He's working for an organization that mentors people after incarceration. He works at the Annapolis UU Church as a staff member. I'm so proud of Dave. If you saw his record, it would tell one story, a scary story, a simple story. But if you get to know him, you know that he is so much more than that story. And that is true for all of us. Maybe not quite as dramatic, but we are all more complex than the stories we tell. Unitarian Universalism helps us to practice sitting in that complexity, allowing our stories to bend, perhaps to break, and be rebuilt over and over. May it be so, and amen.